New Mexico Territory, spring of 1882. The town of Mercy Ridge woke slow, as if it wasn't entirely sure it wanted another day. Dawn came in thin, metallic light, scraping along the line of low adobe buildings and false-fronted wooden stores. The sky over the basin was the color of old paper, a flat, colorless wash that hadn't yet remembered how to be blue. Dust lay in the street in soft drifts, undisturbed except for the faint, crooked trail of last night's boot prints and the narrow double line of a wagon that had passed through after dark and left nothing of itself but ruts. A sign over the saloon door creaked in the early wind, protested its own existence. Farther down, the blacksmith's forge sat cold, door half open like a mouth too tired to close. No voices yet. No piano from the saloon, no clatter from the livery, no church bell. Just the wind and the soft ticking of the world, trying to remember its lines. On the far edge of town, where the last building gave way to open scrub and the first low rise toward the mesas, a man stood alone beside a bay horse, watching the light come up. He was tall and lean, but not the easy leanness of youth. This was a frame pared down by miles and hard winters, by nights spent on camp blankets instead of in beds. His coat, long and trail-worn, hung straight from sharp shoulders. His left leg carried a stiffness he didn't bother hiding. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat, found his jaw, roughened by 2 days' neglect. Jonah Reed squinted toward the eastern ridge, where the road from the county seat wound down in a pale ribbon between the scrub. No dust yet. No riders cresting the rise. They'd come, though. He had been told as much the night before, in the dim mirror of the saloon, over the dull clink of a whiskey glass he hadn't actually tasted. Sheriff Hale's riding in the morning, Hank, the barkeep, had said. Got papers in his pocket and a rope in his head. They say he's coming for Eva Larkin. Jonah had felt the name land inside him like a small stone on still water. The ripples had not yet settled. Now, in the thin light of morning, he let his gaze slip back to the town. Mercy Ridge sat in a shallow bowl between two ridges, its dozen buildings huddled like cattle in a storm. At this hour, you could see too clearly how small it was. How easy it would be for the world to forget it. How easy it was, inside such a place, for one life to be taken and folded into the dust without so much as a mark left behind. He knew something about that. His leg twinged as he swung up into the saddle, a reminder carved deep into bone. The bullet that had gone in below his hip 5 years back had taken more than flesh. A bank job gone crooked in a border town he never spoke of now. A kid with a shaking pistol and something to prove. A woman screaming when the smoke cleared and her brother lay still on the floor. Jonah had left that life in a wash of blood and regret, ridden north with his pockets empty and his conscience full. Mercy Ridge was where the trail had run out. He held a line of fence for the cattleman whose brand gave the town its name. He broke colts that needed breaking. He slept in a narrow room above the livery and didn't ask much of the world beyond work and cold water and a sky that was big enough to take what he couldn't say. He'd done his best, these last years, to be a man people nodded to instead of hid from. Sometimes, when he walked past the small boarding house on the corner, the one with the laundry line strung in the back and the blue curtain in the upstairs window, a woman would be sitting on the porch steps, mending something too worn to deserve the work. They would exchange a nod, nothing more. She had the look of someone holding herself together with both hands and not inclined to share the effort. Eva Larkin. He hadn't known her name at first. Only the shape of her, slight, with shoulders that had learned to be smaller than they needed to be, dark hair braided back and coiled, practical, with loose strands around her face. Her eyes were a gray-flecked green, like water when a storm was thinking about it. She carried herself like someone who had been knocked around by life and had decided to keep moving anyway, if only despite it. Later, he'd learned the rest. Husband, dead. Not by fever or accident, but by a bullet from her own shaking hand. A gambler with too many debts and one temper too many. A long night in their rented room above the mercantile, shouting, crashing, a scream cut short, the sharp crack of a pistol. In the morning, The town had stood in the street and whispered while the law brought her down the stairs with her hair undone and her eyes wide and empty. Self-defense, she'd said. The kind any court with sense would recognize. But Mercy Ridge was small, and the man she'd killed had owed money to people who could hire lawyers in the county seat. Stories got bent. Facts got folded. A woman who'd shot a man, even to save her life, began to look untidy on the ledger. Easier, for some, if she swung. Jonah had listened to the talk. Had watched Eva leave the tiny courtroom with a temporary reprieve and a summons to appear again when the circuit judge returned, with proper charges drawn up. He had watched the way people stepped back as she passed. The way she walked through the gap without looking up, holding herself like someone already halfway to the gallows. He'd done nothing. Now, the sheriff from the county seat was on his way. The law. With papers in his pocket and a noose in his shadow. Jonah eased the bay into a walk, heading not toward town but toward the rise east of it, where the road from the county seat dipped and disappeared for a stretch behind a low cut of rock. The place you saw a rider coming before they saw you. The air smelled of dust and old cold. A hawk circled high, its wings catching what little light there was. Alone on the rise, Jonah dismounted, leading the bay into the lee of a rock outcrop. From here, he could see the road snaking toward him, a pale scar on the land. He wrapped the reins loosely over his gloved hand and waited, hat brim low, mind moving in slow circles. He could ride away. The world was still big enough, even now, for a man with a limp and a past to find another stretch of land where nobody knew his name. He could stay put, let Hale come and take her, let the law churn on as it did, grinding whoever it caught between its teeth. He could tell himself that whatever happened to Eva Larkin wasn't his business. That he'd burned his share of courage on other people's trouble years ago. Instead, he waited. It was past mid-morning when the dust showed on the horizon. 3 riders, moving at an easy lope, the kind of pace men kept when they knew there was nowhere for their quarry to run. The lead man wore a badge on his coat. Even at a distance, Jonah could see the way he sat his horse, straight-backed, steady, a man used to the saddle and to the weight of decisions. Sheriff Thomas Hale, appointed from the county seat, more beholden to the judge's ink than to the whiskey talk in small towns like Mercy Ridge. 2 deputies rode behind him, their coats flapping open to show the dull glint of gunmetal at their hips. Jonah stepped out onto the road. The sheriff reined in when he saw the figure ahead. The deputies came up short behind him, one hand on reins, the other falling automatically toward a holster. Hale's eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat. "You blocking the road for a reason, friend?" he asked. Jonah picked his words like a man picking his way across thin ice. "Name's Jonah Reed," he said. "I work Brant's line out here. Look after his stock." "That so?" Hale said. "I'm not here for cattle." He shifted in the saddle. "I'm here on county business." "I know," Jonah said. "You're riding for Eva Larkin." One of the deputies spit in the dust. "Word travels," he said. Hale studied Jonah a moment longer. "You some kin?" he asked. "No," Jonah said. "Just a man who lives in the same town. Sleeps under the same roof as the people who'll be watching when you ride out with her in front of you." "That's the way of it," Hale said. "She's got charges to answer. Court in the seat will see to what's fair." Jonah felt something old and weary stir inside him. "Fair," he said. "I seen fair. Once or twice. It didn't look much like this." Hale's gaze sharpened. "You planning to tell me how to do my job?" he asked. Jonah shook his head. "No, Sheriff," he said. "I know better than that. Just figured I'd ask you to hear something before you do it." Hale exhaled through his nose, the faintest trace of impatience clouding the cold air. "You can walk and talk," he said. "I've got miles still." Jonah didn't move. "Best we stand," he said. "Town's down there listening, even if you can't see it. Men at the windows. Women on porches. Kids peeking through shutters. They see you ride past me, they'll decide what kind of day this is going to be. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. Hale's jaw tightened. You've got a point, he asked. Jonah thought of smoke and shouting and the echo of gunfire in a stone-walled room far south of here. He thought of another woman, years ago, whose grief had filled a street. He thought of the way he had walked away from that, hands stained, ears ringing, telling himself there was nothing he could have done. Eva Larkin killed her husband, Jonah said. That's a fact. So's this, he was beating her when she did it. Folks in town heard it. Walls don't muffle what a man intends when he's had too much whiskey and not enough soul. She'll have her say in court, Hale replied. Court's 3 days' hard ride from here, Jonah said. It's a room full of strangers who never heard her name till it was inked beside the word murder. It's a judge whose biggest worry is keeping the cattleman's hands clean. You know it. I know it. There's what's written on paper, Sheriff, and then there's what's true. Hale's eyes flickered, just for a moment. You a preacher? He asked. No, Jonah said. Just a man with things on his conscience he'd sleep better carrying if he did one thing right before he went into the ground. Hale's gaze slid past him, toward the low comb of buildings. Jonah could almost see the calculation happening behind those pale eyes. Duty. Habit. The quiet pressure of men with money on the rim of every decision. You're asking me to turn around, Hale said. I'm asking you to remember what this territory looked like before men started drawing lines on it and calling them law, Jonah said. Back when doing what's right was something you felt in your bones, not something you read in a codebook. One of the deputies snorted. Man's in love, he muttered. Jonah didn't rise to it. The warmth that touched his face had nothing to do with the cold. I ain't asking this because I think she'll look at me twice, he said, too quietly for the deputy but not for Hale. I'm asking because I have stood where she's standing. Waiting to see which way a man with a badge would lean. I know what it feels like when he leans the wrong way. Hale's shoulders slumped, just a fraction. The line of his mouth shifted. You've killed men, he said. Yes, Jonah said. Some who needed killing. Some who didn't. I can still see the difference when I sleep, Sheriff. Can you? The wind came down off the ridge, cutting between them. The horses stamped, breath pluming. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Hale took off his hat, ran a gloved hand through hair gone thinner than it used to be. I come all this way, he said wearily, with warrants signed and witnesses waiting, and you picked this morning to stand in the road and put the weight of every bad call I ever made on my shoulders. Weight's already there, Jonah said. I just gave it a name. Hale huffed a humorless breath. Damn you, he said. But there was no heat in it. He looked back at his deputies. You boys ride on into town, he said. Tell him I'll be along. Tate, the one who'd spoken, stared. You serious? He said. Dead, Hale answered. Go on. Get yourself some coffee. And mind you don't talk more than you have to. They went, reluctantly, horses kicking up small puffs of dust. When they were out of earshot, Hale looked down at Jonah. She killed a man, he said again, quieter now. That don't go away because you've got regrets. No, Jonah said. But maybe the way we answer it does. Hale's fingers toyed with the folded papers in his pocket. I could take her in, he said. Do it by the book. World stays simple that way. World was never simple, Jonah said. We just pretended it was, so we could sleep. Hale slid the warrants out, looked at the names. A woman's. The dead man's. The judge's looping signature. You know what happens if I don't serve these? He asked. You get letters, Jonah said. Maybe a visit. Maybe they take your star, send you somewhere with less sky and more walls. Maybe you end up like me. A man who used to be something and now just is. Hale's mouth twisted. And you think that's worth it? For her? Jonah's leg throbbed. His side ached with old ghosts. He thought of Eva on her porch steps, the way she'd tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear with hands that shook more than the motion warranted. The way she'd stood in that makeshift courtroom, spine straight, eyes distant, while men debated whether she was worth believing. I think, he said slowly, it's worth it for what it makes of us. Hale looked at him a long time. Then, with a small sigh, he tore the second page down the middle. The tear was loud in the still air. He let the pieces fall, small scraps of paper landing in the dust, words and ink and signatures suddenly nothing more than litter. The world won't thank me for that, he said. No, Jonah agreed. Neither will my superiors. No. Hale folded the remaining page once, twice, tucked it back into his coat. But I'll know, he said. He settled his hat back on his head. You ride down with me, he said. We'll drink some of that coffee. You can tell Miss Larkin yourself what she owes you. Then you take yourself out of whatever trouble you're in, because I won't be stepping in front of you again. Jonah nodded once. That's fair, Sheriff, he said. They rode down together, side by side, into the small town. By the time they reached Mercy Ridge, eyes were already at the windows. People drifted into doorways as if drawn by a string. Eva stood on the boardwalk outside the boarding house, shawl pulled tight, as if she'd heard the hoofbeats from farther off than most. Her face was pale, but still. Only her hands betrayed her, the way they gripped the fabric at her elbows. Hale swung down first. Miss Larkin, he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest ears. I come on circuit business. Her chin lifted, just a fraction. I know, she said. Hale reached into his coat. For a moment, Jonah saw her eyes go somewhere else, to a rope, to a cell, to a road she wouldn't walk back down. Then Hale offered her the folded paper. I come to tell you that the territorial court has reviewed the evidence in your husband's death, he said. And in light of the testimony available, and the interest of justice, they won't be pursuing further action. You're free to remain in Mercy Ridge, or leave it, as you see fit. The street breathed, all at once. A sound like wind in tall grass. Eva stared at the paper, then at him. I don't understand, she said. Hale's gaze flicked briefly toward Jonah, then back. Sometimes, he said, things land where they ought to, instead of where it's easiest. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked down the street to the saloon, leaving the deputies scrambling after him in a confusion that would turn to gossip before sundown. Jonah slid off his horse, suddenly more tired than he'd felt that morning. Eva's eyes found him. Cowboy, she said, voice barely more than breath. What did you do? He shook his head. Nothing the world will mark down, he said. She stepped down from the boardwalk, boots hitting the street. Up close, he could see the strain etched in the corners of her mouth, the fresh, fragile space where terror had been. Cowboy, she said again. Why did you risk your life for me? He thought of every mile that had brought him here. Of faces he'd never see again. Of choices made at crossroads with guns in his hands and the wrong kind of men at his back. Because once, he said quietly, I didn't. And a good person died for it. I couldn't carry another of those. Her throat worked. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know enough, he said. I've seen the way you walk. Like the world spent and you're still paying. I've seen you feed strays behind the boarding house when you thought nobody watched. I've heard you sing to yourself when you hang laundry, like you've got more in you than the lines on some judge's paper. That's enough for me. She looked at him a long moment, eyes bright with something too complicated to name. I can't pay you back, she said. Wasn't alone, he answered. For a heartbeat, there was just the two of them, standing in the street in a town that had already begun rewriting what it had seen into something it could live with. Then life moved again. A door closed somewhere. Hank's piano in the saloon picked up a tune. The blacksmith's hammer started its steady, ringing work. Later, when the heat of midday had burned the chill off the air, Jonah packed his few things into a saddlebag. He had promised Hale he'd see to his own trouble now. There would be questions, in the county seat and beyond, about the warrants that hadn't been served. Men with ink-stained fingers who'd want a name to hang their displeasure on. He figured he could stand it better than Eva could. He led the bay past the boarding house. Eva came out onto the porch. "You're leaving," she said. "For a while," he answered. "Might be better if the wind clears my trail some before the law comes asking why it turned the way it did." She gripped the porch post. "Will you come back?" she asked. He looked out over the basin, to where the land stretched away, open and indifferent. "Don't know," he said. "World's big. Trouble's patient." He met her eyes again. "But I know this, you've got more days now than you thought you did. Make 'em count, Eva. For both of us." She stepped down, close enough to touch his sleeve. She didn't. Her hand hovered, then fell. "If you ever ride this way again," she said, "there'll be a room upstairs that's not let, and a coffee cup that's not spoken for." Something in his chest loosened. "I'll remember," he said. He swung up into the saddle, leg complaining in the old familiar way. As he rode out of Mercy Ridge, the town shrank behind him, the buildings settling back into the basin as if exhaling. The sky ahead was still colorless, but the line where it met the land looked less like an ending and more like a beginning. He didn't know what waited on the next ridge. New trouble, most likely. Old ghosts, always. But there was a woman in a small town who would wake tomorrow without a rope hanging over her imagination. A sheriff who would carry a torn warrant in his memory instead of in his pocket. A choice made on a dusty road that might echo, in quiet ways, long after Jonah Reed's name was forgotten. Redemption, he thought, wasn't the kind of thing that came all at once, wrapped in light. It was a slow, stubborn turning towards something better, one small, painful act at a time. Behind him, in Mercy Ridge, Eva Larkin stood on the porch and watched until horse and rider were no more than a mote of dust on the horizon. When the boarding house girl asked her, days later, why she kept a second plate on the shelf and a spare cup by the stove, Eva only smiled, a little sadly. "Once," she said, "a man risked his life to show me I was worth more than a noose. Some things you live the rest of your days honoring. Even if he never comes back." The wind moved through the alleyways and over the ridge, carrying the faint memory of hoofbeats and the quiet certainty of a choice that had changed the shape of two lives. In a world that liked to write endings in black ink and rope, that was its own kind of miracle.